Elderly millionaire offers an old piano to a choir girl, unaware that she would play like a true prodigy before the entire room. On the morning the piano was unveiled, Mrs. Adelaide Bresson's mansion seemed suspended in time, as if every object, every painting, every ray of sunlight piercing through the linen curtains was waiting for a note yet to be played. The heiress of the Bresson pianos, founder of one of Europe's most renowned classical instrument factories, now lived in seclusion on her estate on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, her days steeped in a respectful silence she herself mistook for peace. Adelaide was not a cruel woman. She was merely forgotten by herself and by others. Her elegance was timeless, but her gaze betrayed a veiled judgment that preceded any smile. When organizing the annual charity tea to raise funds for the First Baptist Church choir, Adelaide expected no emotion, just courtesy, polite applause, and another opportunity to reaffirm her importance. The old piano, covered with a white sheet like a bride's veil, was to be the centerpiece of the afternoon, a gesture she saw as symbolic, a monument to her generosity, not an instrument for new miracles. The girl was not on the program. She entered through the side door of the mansion, her hair tied haphazardly, her white t-shirt stained with gouache paint, and her left shoe slightly larger than her right. Her name was Lucia. Little was known about her, except that she sang in the church choir, and that her mother had been cleaning houses in the neighborhood for over a decade, including Mrs. Bresson's own. That afternoon, Lucia's mother had asked permission to bring her along, just to watch. But Adelaide, ever prone to acts that masked her haughtiness with forced generosity, had a performative idea when she saw Lucia approach the piano with a spark in her eyes that Adelaide herself no longer recognized. "Little girl," she said, slightly raising her chin as the guest smiled and watched with a kind of polished condescension. "How about being the first to play it? Show us how they play in homes where sheet music doesn't reach." The laughter was discreet, as if there were an unspoken agreement that humiliation should be elegant, but in Lucia's eyes, nothing was absorbed as mockery. She simply nodded with an almost unsettling serenity, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life, not to prove something but to fulfill something. She sat carefully on the wooden bench, as if asking permission from the wood itself, and raised her hands with a slight tremble, not of fear, but of reverence. And then, silence. It was not merely the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of the world bowing to listen. The first chords escaped the keys with an enchanting timidity, as if Lucia were reviving an old friend who had slept for centuries. Within seconds, the hesitancy melted like snow in the sun, and what followed was something between a lament and a prayer. There was no sheet music, no instruction, just raw emotion, poured into complex and instinctive harmonies that no adult present could name, but that everyone felt coiling around their bones. Adelaide's eyes widened. For a moment, her expression hardened, like that of someone witnessing a miracle, and out of pride trying to deny it. The teacups trembled in the hands of the pearl-necklaced ladies. One of the men present, a former conservatory pianist, discreetly let a tear fall. And when the final note faded, echoing through the high ceiling of the room as if begging to linger forever, no one dared to clap, because applause would have been vulgar in the face of what they had just witnessed. Lucia lowered her hands. Her gaze drifted from the faces and settled on the dark wood of the piano as if thanking it. Then she stood silently and walked back to the corner of the room, where her mother stood watching, her hands still damp with sweat and soap. Adelaide had not yet spoken. For the first time in a long while, her mind seemed like an empty room, where the voice of pride did not echo. She approached the piano as if it were a freshly opened tomb. She ran her hand over the keys. Then she finally murmured, "That piece. I've heard it before. My son used to play something like that before he passed." The room grew colder, not because a window had been opened, but because everyone felt something invisible had just broken inside her. She turned to Lucia's mother. "Did you teach her?" she asked, as if searching for logic in what was pure spirit. The woman shook her head. "She taught herself. We don't have a piano, but she listens." Adelaide didn't respond immediately. She took 2 more steps, stopped in front of Lucia, and bent down, an act that, for a woman like her, was almost revolutionary. "What did you listen to play like that?" The girl answered with a clear, timid voice. "The silence of the house. Sometimes it sings." The words struck the old woman's chest like silent thunder. Behind the guests, the world began to reorder its weights. The humble child was no longer just an invisible guest. She was a vertex, a point of inversion. The piano, once a symbol of status, was now a witness to the fall of an empire built on pride and the rise of a queen without a throne. That same week, Adelaide cancelled her symbolic donation to the choir and made an even more impactful decision. She placed her mansion under the stewardship of a foundation for the musical education of girls in vulnerable situations. Lucia was the first student, but she never called herself the girl who became a prodigy. She continued cleaning, helping, serving. She played as one washes dishes, with devotion. And sometimes when the piano sounded at night, even with no one nearby, it was said that the sound it produced was not from the keys but from grateful spirits. A departed boy, a broken pride, and a child who returned music to the world. In the days following that impromptu recital, the city's society columns were filled with rumors, whispers, and clumsy descriptions of what had truly happened at the Bresson mansion. Some said the old lady had been touched by God. Others murmured it was all an eccentric performance. But among true musicians, those who knew how to listen with their souls, a silent certainty began to spread. A child had reincarnated the language of the sacred in a piano everyone thought was dead. Adelaide, for her part, refused all interviews. The silence that once filled the house like a veil of nobility now seemed like penance. She spent hours in the library looking at old albums of her son, who had died in a boating accident 25 years earlier. He was a misunderstood genius, she used to say, but only now did she realize that perhaps she had never truly listened to her own son. She had applauded his technique, praised his flawless notes, but ignored the pain and the desire to create something beyond the frames of prestige. It was there, in the solitude of her regrets, that she decided on the foundation. The deed was transferred quietly. The old Bresson mansion, which for decades had been the stage for dinners with ambassadors and politicians, would now become Harmony House, a space for artistic training for girls who, like Lucia, carried music in their bones, even without ever seeing sheet music. The transformation, however, was not smooth. The local elite responded with the same cold courtesy they always used to manage social tensions. A good deed, no doubt, but a bit radical, don't you think? They said in their tea circles. Mrs. Haverford, for example, who organized the city's annual classical music festival, subtly suggested it would be more appropriate to keep the initiative in another neighborhood to avoid displacing the girls. Adelaide, this time, responded with a phrase that would go down in history. The displacement we need is not geographical, it is moral. Meanwhile, Lucia kept playing, but now with a piano of her own, not the old one from the living room, but a lovingly restored upright placed in the former tea room. Every morning before classes, she sat there for 20 minutes, as if praying. She played slowly, with humility. Sometimes she made mistakes, other times she cried. It was as if she were searching the world's depths for forgotten notes. One afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at Harmony House. It was Maestro Claude Dumas, a Frenchman known for his volatile temperament and perfect pitch. He had received a video of the girl playing, secretly filmed by one of Adelaide's former employees, and had come with the usual arrogance of those who believe talent is inherited, not discovered. Lucia was called to play for him. She hadn't rehearsed. Nothing had been arranged. She sat as she always did, without pretense, and she played. This time it wasn't a familiar piece. It was pure improvisation, a sequence of minor chords that seemed to tell ancient secrets. The maestro closed his eyes. Sweat ran down his forehead, not from heat, but from surrender. At the end, he stood abruptly, walked to the girl and said only, "You don't play, you bleed," and he left without saying goodbye. In the days that followed, an invitation arrived from Europe. The Geneva Academy offered Lucia a full scholarship. Her mother, emotional, hesitated. She didn't want to lose her daughter. But Lucia held her hand and whispered, "It's just a leap, Mom. The sound returns to where it was born." Adelaide, now with whiter hair and a softer gaze, accompanied Lucia to the airport. At the gate, she handed her a leather-bound notebook. "This was my son's. He composed in it. I never showed it to anyone. Now it's yours." Lucia held it with reverence. "I'll take care of what he started." The years passed. Lucia became a celebrated composer in concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo. But she never stopped returning to Harmony House at the end of each year. She played with the new girls, listened to their stories, taught them to hear the silences. She never accepted being called a prodigy. She only said, "I was heard." Adelaide passed away 5 years after the foundation was established. In her will, she left a clause that her coffin be carried in silence to the sound of a single piano played by Lucia, and that there be no flowers, only sheet music composed by the girls who had lived under her roof. The funeral took place in the same room where it all began. Lucia sat at the old piano and played, not for death, but for gratitude. It was as if each key that sounded said, "At last you listened." In the first spring after Adelaide's death, the garden of the old mansion, which had once been purely aesthetic, designed for exhibitions and dinners, bloomed like never before. The roses, now without hired gardeners, grew freely, and the trees that had once been aligned like soldiers now leaned over one another, creating soft shadows where Harmony House students read sheet music and talked about things only those who carry melodies in their hearts understand. It was as if even nature had decided to rewrite its score under a new conductor. Lucia, back after her second concert in Berlin, walked through the garden in silence. Her name now ranked among the prodigies of the century, but she hadn't changed. Her eyes still watched the ground, her hands remained discreet. The only things that had changed were the scars on her fingers, proof that playing the world requires more than talent. It requires resilience. She had refused record labels that demanded she sell herself better, as they put it, with flashier dresses and rehearsed poses. She responded with the firmness of those who carry inner truths. "My sound doesn't need a costume. It needs space." That afternoon in Charleston would be special. Harmony House was celebrating its 5th anniversary, and the first girls to graduate would return for a collective performance. Among them was Clara, a 13-year-old daughter of a gas delivery man who had begun her studies with a toy keyboard. There would also be Miriam, granddaughter of Haitian refugees whose perfect pitch defied any academic test. It would be a reunion, but also a celebration, not of success, but of the seed. In the hall, Adelaide's old piano still reigned, but now, with visible marks of time and small imperfections, no one dared to fix, as if the scratches were words that must not be erased. Lucia ran her hand over it before the concert began. She looked at the ceiling, as if speaking to someone invisible, and whispered, "Thank you for humbling me, Mrs. Bresson. Your arrogance opened the doors for me." The guests began to arrive, among them a familiar face from the local high society, Beatrice Haverford, the same woman who had once suggested moving the foundation to a more appropriate neighborhood. She was older, with subtle wrinkles and a gaze that tried to remain distant, but something in her presence was different. When greeting Lucia, her tone was less assured. She said, "I came back to listen today without criticism." Lucia merely smiled, not as one who forgives, but as one who transcends. The concert began with Miriam, who performed an original composition called Crossing, dedicated to her grandmother. Then came Clara with a melodic piece inspired by the sounds of her neighborhood. Each note, a memory, each pause, a space for those who were never heard. Lucia, finally, didn't play right away. She walked to the center of the room and spoke for the first time aloud to an audience. "When I was 8, I thought pianos were for the rich. Then I discovered that music doesn't ask for your address. It invades, it inhabits, it whispers even when everything around it screams. Today I won't play something of my own. I'll play the last piece written by Mrs. Adelaide's son, found in a forgotten notebook." The room froze. The sheet music was placed on the piano like a reliquary. Lucia sat, closed her eyes, began to play. It was an unfinished piece with interrupted measures, phrases that seemed to cry for help. But Lucia didn't just perform it. She completed it, intuitively, with delicate variations, modulating feelings no one knew how to name. It was as if the departed boy were writing from beyond, and she were merely translating. When it ended, tears streamed down many faces, but the silence held like a sacred veil. Beatrice, who had once criticized the project, stood and said in a trembling voice, "I never knew pain could be so beautiful." Lucia responded only with a look, not of triumph, but of peace. After the concert, one of the new students approached and asked, "Do you think one day I'll play like you?" Lucia smiled. She touched the girl's chest with her finger and said, "If you play from here, you're already playing more than me." That night, something changed in the city. The streets that once knew only the sound of church bells now whispered sweet notes from the open windows of Harmony House. The project began receiving requests from other cities, even other countries. But Lucia always responded, "I don't want to expand. I want to deepen. The sound doesn't need to go farther. It needs to go deeper." In her room, she still kept the old notebook of Adelaide's son. She had already completed 3 pieces based on his unfinished compositions. In each one she signed as Children of Silence, because she understood that nothing she did was hers alone. It was part of a chain, an echo. On the back cover of the notebook, she found, years later, a phrase written in a child's handwriting. "One day someone will hear what I tried to say." Lucia smiled. "Someone already has," she replied softly, closing the notebook with reverence. The final weeks of autumn brought a golden hue to the trees of Harmony House, as if the sky were descending in the form of leaves to touch the ground where so many invisible seeds had been planted. Lucia was now a grown woman, not in age, but in presence. She had learned that some people age, others mature, and some bloom in silence, and she was one of the latter. She walked without announcing herself, but her presence altered the environment, like the sound of a note that lingers long after the key is released. That afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the house. She was a middle-aged woman with simple clothes and sad eyes. Her name was Clara Souza. She held the hand of a thin girl with disheveled hair and a vacant gaze. "She hasn't spoken since she was 3, she said of her daughter, "but I heard you listen even to what no one says." Lucia said nothing. She knelt before the girl, opened the lid of a small keyboard and began to play slowly the same piece she had completed from Adelaide's son. The girl watched. Her fingers began to mimic the movement, and then, without a word, she played the first 2 measures by ear, with perfection. Lucia looked up at the mother. "She listens," she said, "but no one has ever spoken her language." Clara wept, and for the first time since childhood, Lucia felt she was becoming Adelaide. Not in coldness, but in legacy. A woman who, instead of controlling the voices around her, now set them free. She understood then the true meaning of justice, not just correcting wrongs, but making space for what is just to flourish. The following month, Lucia received an honor from the local government. She would be named Honorary Citizen for Cultural Contribution, a formal ceremony with authorities, press, and speeches, but when handed the microphone, she veered from the script. She said only, "For a long time, I thought my story began the day I played that old piano. But today I understand it began long before, when my mother scrubbed the hallways of that house with hands that also knew how to conduct silence. Sound, my friends, is born from listening, and only those small enough to fit inside another can truly listen." Silence, and then an applause that seemed to come not from hands, but from a collective heart. Later, as she quietly left the ceremony, Lucia walked to the cemetery where Adelaide had been buried. She placed a white rose and a small note with just 3 words on the grave. "I heard you." That night, the winds blowing over Charleston seemed to carry soft notes, as if the entire city were being cradled by a melody only the humble could hear. Harmony House, lit by small yellow lights, looked like a living score, where each window was a rest, each girl a note. Lucia, sitting in her room, wrote the final pages of a book that would be published months later, The Song of the Invisible. It was not an autobiography, it was a score of stories. Each chapter told the journey of a girl who had crossed the iron gate of the foundation without knowing she would find not just sound, but voice. On the last page she wrote, "Justice for me was not seeing the powerful fall. It was seeing the invisible be heard. We touch the world, not with our hands, but with what we carry in silence. And sometimes, only when a child plays an old piano, does the sky finally listen." The book became a landmark, but Lucia never sought fame. She continued walking in the mornings with coffee in hand and worn slippers. She continued listening to the whispers of the old wood in the hall. She continued teaching that playing well is less important than touching someone. In the last scene recorded of her on video, in a documentary filmed discreetly for television, she is at the old piano. A new, shy student asks, "Do you think I'm special?" Lucia smiles warmly. She touches the keys, plays 3 soft notes, looks at the girl and replies, "If you weren't, the world would be a little quieter." The camera pulls back slowly, and the sound remains.